Landon Clement couldn't believe his luck when he heard a rustle in the leaves during the first few minutes of his elk hunt. But what he thought was an elk turned out to be a grizzly and her cubs, and he was soon locked in the fight of his life. That day, Landon, his father Don, and his cousin Chris Harper joined family friend John Quintrell for a bow hunting trip in Wyoming's Upper Green River area. Only Landon and John had elk tags. The two others were just along for the adventure. And what an adventure it turned out to be! They rode into the wilderness on an off-road UTV. Then, whilst Don and Chris hiked further into the woodland on a scouting mission, Landon and John headed for a hillside with a great position for spotting elk coming into the clearing below. The two hunters set themselves up 300 yards apart. Landon nestled up against a large boulder. It was well hidden with some deadwood scattered on the ground. Less than 2 minutes later, he heard the distinctive rustling of leaves coming from one side. He couldn't believe his luck. He hadn't even taken his bow off his back, and now an elk was going to walk right past him. He had definitely chosen a prime spot, or so he thought. He strained his neck to look around the boulder and caught a glimpse of brown. It was going to be a large elk. He could hear its heavy footsteps on the fallen leaves and the cracking of twigs. He pulled his bow and arrows out ready and held his breath. But to his complete disbelief, it wasn't an elk. Instead, it was a grizzly bear. And she wasn't alone. Scuttling along beside her were two cubs. He could see them clearly now. The distinctive hump on the mother's back. The enormous head swaying slightly with each footstep. Landon was in the worst position imaginable. He was tight against the boulder with nowhere to go. He pressed himself as hard as he could against the stone and dared not breathe. He pulled out his pistol in case they came for him. But Landon hoped it wouldn't come to that. He prayed that they would continue on down the hill and not notice him. Then, to his horror, instead of walking down the hill away from his position, the bears turned upwards. They followed a little path through the trees, a path that led directly to the boulder where Landon was hiding. He knew something bad was about to happen, and he readied himself. Seconds later, he saw all three bears stop on the spot and lift their noses skywards. They had caught his scent. Then Landon watched in terror as the mother turned instantly and looked directly at him. He had been spotted. He was in for it now. She was 12 yards away, and she had no mercy. She thundered towards Landon, and he barely had time to squeeze the trigger on his pistol. She covered the distance in a single second, an explosion of raw power torpedoing at Landon. He fired his Glock 10mm 3 or 4 times as she charged at him, her mouth agape, her eyes fixed on his. Her protective instincts were coursing through her body, and she saw Landon as a threat to her offspring. The cracks of the shots rang out and the cubs scampered away, never to be seen again. But the gun didn't stop the mother. She was struck once or twice, but her immense size and power kept her going. Landon heard her huff-huff as she came for him, the sound of a steam train charging down. Then came the inevitable. She grabbed Landon's left thigh and bit down. The adrenaline fueling Landon's body concealed the pain, but Landon could feel the pressure of the bite. She was ferocious as she shook her enormous head from side to side, shaking Landon like a rag doll. Landon had heard of attacks like this before. He had witnessed firsthand the power of a grizzly when one charged and knocked him over on a previous hunting trip. But he was overwhelmed with the raw power of this female. He couldn't imagine anything stronger or more fearful on the planet. She just unleashed hell on him, and he was entirely at her mercy. He was still squeezing the trigger of his pistol, over and over again, but in the heat of the moment he paused for a second and realized that the semi-automatic was no longer firing. To his disbelief, it was jammed. Of all the moments for a gun to jam, it chose this one. That could have cost him his life. He could have lain down his weapon and given up then and there, but he kept fighting. Clearing a jammed pistol was often challenging at the best of times, but with a 600-pound bear biting down on you and tossing you around, it was even harder to do. But Landon knew that it was a matter between life and death. He knew that the pistol was all he had to protect himself, and that the grizzly wasn't letting go. Miraculously, he managed to unjam the gun, and he brought it over and above the bear's head. He fired 3 shots, and the bear immediately let go and tumbled backwards. It was dead. Landon rushed down the hill, hobbling and screaming for John, Don, and Chris. All of a sudden, his senses returned. The adrenaline was wearing off, and he began to comprehend the gravity of the situation. He had come within an inch of losing his life. When he looked down at the pistol in his hand, it had jammed once more. If it had jammed again before delivering the fatal shot, then in all likelihood the bear would have won the fight. An incredible smell filled his nostrils. It was coming from the bear. It smelt of rotten meat, damp and garbage. The smell was overpowering. Landon's hand shook by his side. His leg was oozing blood from the open wound in the thigh. He felt lightheaded and dizzy. The world went blurry, and he slumped down against a tree, dazed by the near-death experience he'd just had. John had overheard his cries for help and had come running. The multiple shots from the pistol had rung out and alerted Don and Chris to the situation, and they rushed to the scene as quickly as they could. They were 3/4 of a mile away and scrambled over fallen trees, rocks, and boulders to get to the others. When John arrived, he found Landon slouched against the tree. He could tell he was in a bad way. Just a few yards away was the bear. There was no sign of the cubs anywhere. When the others made it to their location, John rushed off to fetch the UTV and bring it closer. Landon had to make an agonizing 1.5-mile hike back to the vehicle. He was now in excruciating agony and propped himself up with a stick and help from his father and cousin. It was slow going, but they eventually made it to the vehicle, and the others rushed him to Pinedale Clinic. Landon was lucky that the bear hadn't severed any arteries. The doctors stitched him up, but as he was recovering in the clinic, game wardens came to question him over the dead bear. It is illegal to kill bears in the lower 48 states, except in self-defense. It is standard protocol for game wardens to investigate the killing of any brown bear, and Landon had to take the wardens out to the site of the shooting so that they could understand exactly what happened. Landon was sad about shooting the bear. He did not want to pull the trigger, especially not on a mother with cubs, but he knew that in that moment, it was either him or her. He has always and always will admire grizzlies. They are a part of the great outdoors that he loves so much. He doubts that bear spray would have stopped the charge. It all happened so quickly, and it felt as though the bear would stop at nothing to protect her young. Landon said that he thinks bringing back the hunting of grizzlies in Wyoming might save human lives by making them more fearful, but in his words, "I do not want the grizzlies to go away. They are a beautiful animal, and they should be free to roam this earth that God gave us." In mid-October 2018, dark clouds loomed over Michalchuk's property in Bella Coola, British Columbia. He and his wife had just returned from a week-long trip, eager to reunite with their children and share stories of their travels. However, their homecoming came with unsettling news. During their absence, Michalchuk's in-laws, who had been caring for the children, reported a growing problem. Grizzly bears had moved into the yard. A mother bear and her 3 cubs had claimed the property as their own, causing increasing destruction. Drawn by the fruit trees, they would climb the branches, feast on the ripened fruit, dig through the earth in search of roots, and leave their droppings scattered across the yard. What had started as occasional visits had quickly turned into a dangerous situation. Spending time outdoors was becoming a challenge. The children were afraid, and despite their best efforts, Michalchuk's in-laws had been unable to drive the bears away. They had tried making loud noises, shaking a bucket filled with nuts and bolts, but the grizzlies remained unfazed. These bears weren't just passing through, they were confident, territorial, and seemed to regard Michalchuk's family as intruders rather than the rightful occupants of the land. If they returned, something had to be done. Grizzly bears are among nature's most formidable predators. Powerful, fast, and incredibly tough. As one of the largest subspecies of brown bear, they are both resilient and fiercely protective of their young. While many people might find the idea of living in such close proximity to these animals unthinkable, in Bella Coola, British Columbia, grizzlies are a fact of life. The region is well known for frequent human-bear interactions. With its dense forests and abundant rivers, Bella Coola is a natural paradise for both people and wildlife. Tourists flock to the area for bear-watching tours and safaris, drawn by the opportunity to see these magnificent creatures up close. But some argue that this increased human presence has made the bears more brazen, less fearful of people than they should be. And as a result, encounters with aggressive grizzlies have become more common. Lawrence Michalchuk knew he couldn't allow this situation to escalate. A mother grizzly and her 3 cubs had essentially claimed his yard, and he feared a disaster was looming. His children were young, and his daughter was especially terrified, understandably so. She had already suffered a traumatic bear attack in the past, leaving her with a severe arm injury. Michalchuk couldn't shake the thought of history repeating itself. If a fully grown adult was no match for an enraged grizzly, what chance would a child have? At 54 years old, Lawrence Michalchuk knew his duty as a father and husband. He had to protect his family. If the bears returned, he wasn't going to let them take over his property again. As expected, the following morning, the grizzlies emerged once more. There was no denying their beauty, the way they moved, their sheer presence. But admiration didn't change the fact that they posed a threat. Michalchuk didn't want to harm them, but he needed to make them understand that this was not their home. Determined, he grabbed his shotgun, loaded with birdshot, and stepped outside. His wife and children remained inside, watching nervously from a window. His wife, sensing the weight of the moment, decided to film everything. Michalchuk wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't trying to frighten his children either. He simply wanted to send a clear message to the bears. Standing beneath his front deck, his loyal dog by his side, he took a deep breath and fired his first shot into the air. The loud blast echoed through the yard. Ideally, that would be enough. The bears would get startled and run off. But things didn't go as planned. Rather than retreating, the mother grizzly locked eyes with him. She wasn't leaving without a challenge. In an instant, she charged straight at him. Panic surged through Michalchuk. Without hesitation, he turned and bolted for the house, barely making it inside. His heart pounded as he watched from the window. Eventually, the bear and her cubs seemed to lose interest and began moving away. Relief washed over him. Maybe they had finally understood. They weren't welcome here. Maybe this time, they were truly leaving for good. Still, he wanted to be sure. With the bears now at a distance, he decided to give them one final push. Once again, he stepped outside, shotgun at the ready. Another shot rang out into the air, meant to reinforce the warning. That turned out to be a mistake. The mother bear stopped in her tracks. Michalchuk shouted, hoping to scare her off once and for all. Another bad move. In an instant, the grizzly's ears flattened, her head pulled back, and her mouth opened. The sun glinted off them as she let out a deep, guttural roar. And then, she charged. This wasn't just a warning. This was a full-on attack. The mother grizzly was furious. She wasn't just defending her territory. She was protecting her young, just as fiercely as Michalchuk was trying to protect his own. This is bad. Really bad, Michalchuk thought, panic creeping in. I don't think I'm going to make it back to the house. But he had no choice. He had to try. His children were inside. He couldn't let this be the end. Then disaster nearly struck. His right shoe slipped off. For a split second, he stumbled, nearly losing his balance. He waited until the grizzly crossed the driveway. Then, in a split-second decision, he raised his shotgun, took aim at her right leg, and pulled the trigger. The shot connected. The bear collapsed onto the ground, stunned. Michalchuk didn't waste a single second. He turned and sprinted for his life, knowing he had only moments before the bear recovered. And he was right. Within seconds, the Grizzly was back on her feet, her rage undiminished. She resumed the chase, her massive frame tearing across the yard. But by then, Michalchuk had already reached the door. He lunged inside, slamming it shut behind him. His chest heaved, his hands shook, but he was alive. From the safety of their home, the family watched as the mother bear finally turned away, gathering her cubs. Without another glance back, the four animals disappeared into the wilderness. Later, Michalchuk reported the incident to BC conservation officers. His wife, still shaken from the ordeal, decided to upload the footage to YouTube. Along with the video, Michalchuk shared his side of the story, unaware of the firestorm of controversy that was about to ignite. There was no blood, no fur left behind, and I know she'll be sore, but at least now she'll think twice before approaching humans, Michalchuk explained. I spoke with the local conservation officers, showed them the footage, and they assured me I was fully justified in protecting myself and my family. Honestly, I'm just grateful it was me out there and not my kids. However, once the video went public, it triggered a storm of backlash. Critics condemned his decision to fire at the bear, accusing him of unnecessary aggression. Michalchuk stood by his actions, insisting that he never intended to seriously harm the animal, hence his choice to use birdshot. I didn't want to blind her by aiming for the face, so I targeted her right side instead, hoping to trip her up just long enough for me to escape, he explained. That bear wasn't going to leave, he added. In the end, maybe it all worked out for the best, because she's still alive, and so am I. Brutally attacked and left fighting for his life, Evans had to push past pain, fear, and exhaustion just to survive. At 32 years old, Jeremy Evans wasn't new to the outdoors. He had spent 17 years hunting, mastering the skills needed to track and take down game. Unlike most hunters who stuck close to roads and towns, Evans preferred to venture deep into the wild, into the rugged backcountry of Alberta's Rockies. Hunting wasn't just a hobby for him. It was a way to disconnect from modern life, to live like his ancestors had. Every year, he would spend 2 months in the wilderness, tracking deer, elk, moose, and sheep. He was especially passionate about bow hunting, relying on skill and patience instead of modern firepower. He had always been lucky, always came back with a trophy. Until one day, he didn't. On August 24, 2017, Evans set out for a 3-day scouting trip in preparation for ram hunting season. He had spent weeks planning, determined to finally tag a big ram. He packed his gear, loaded his mountain bike into his truck, and said goodbye to his wife, Joyce, and their 6-month-old daughter. It was a 3-hour drive to a starting point, and the excitement was almost too much to contain. The wild was calling. Evans had no idea that this trip would turn into the fight of his life. With his backpack secured and mountain bike ready, he set off into the rugged wilderness of Alberta's Rocky Mountains. The Canadian Rockies are breathtaking. Towering peaks, deep valleys, rushing rivers, and glacial lakes that shimmer like gems. It's a land of raw beauty and untamed wilderness, but it's also home to some of the most dangerous predators in North America. Evans wasn't here for sightseeing, he had a plan. 7 to 9 miles from his base camp, deep in the backcountry, was the perfect scouting location for bighorn sheep. Most hunters wouldn't dare venture that far, especially not on a bike. As he pedaled down the dark trail, Evans passed 2 other hunters, one of whom gave him a puzzled look. He knew exactly why. Most hunters stick to safer, more accessible spots, but Evans had a strategy. Let the others push the sheep deeper into the wilderness, right into his sights. His destination was a remote area known as Crying Canyon, a place so steep and isolated that few hunters ever set foot there. To Evans, that was an advantage. The fewer people around, the better the hunt. By the time he reached the canyon, in the distance a small herd of sheep moved along the rocky slopes. Evans stopped, pulled out his binoculars, and watched them in silence. Everything felt perfect. The untouched wilderness, the quiet rhythm of nature. He stood there for over 10 minutes, soaking it all in. Then, as he lowered his binoculars, he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. A small brown shape was moving toward him. Evans froze. His heart pounded. He knew exactly what he was looking at: a bear cub. And where there's a cub, there's always a protective mother nearby. A heavy feeling of dread washed over him. He had seconds to react. Slowly, he reached for his bear spray, knowing it was his best chance. But there wasn't enough time. Evans suddenly realized his biggest mistake. His bear spray was buried deep in his backpack. He hadn't clipped it to his belt like he normally would, and his rifle? It wasn't loaded. In that moment, he knew he was in serious trouble. A sharp crack echoed from behind. Jeremy Evans turned his head and his blood ran cold. A grizzly sow, wild-eyed and enraged, was charging straight at him. The bear was less than 4 feet away. In an instant, it was on him, rearing up with one massive paw raised, ready to strike. Its jaws were wide open, revealing razor-sharp canines, and its eyes rolled back in fury. There was no doubt about what was coming next. Evans had no time to think, only to act. He grabbed his mountain bike, shoving it between himself and the grizzly. In the same motion, he snatched up his backpack, using it like a shield to push the bear back. For a split second, it worked. But the bear wasn't giving up. Evans swung his backpack, slamming it against the grizzly's head, while desperately trying to push its face away. The struggle was fierce, but the bear was too strong. Then, pain shot through his hand. The grizzly clamped down with its powerful jaws, its teeth sinking deep into his flesh. He wrestled and fought, refusing to let go. The battle raged on until the bike was knocked aside, and the grizzly finally stepped back, about 30 feet away. This was his chance. Evans fumbled for his 10mm Glock, trying to load it with shaky hands, but the fight wasn't over. The bear turned and charged again. Evans threw his backpack aside and ran, straight up the mountainside. His instincts screamed one thing: find a tree. Spotting a spruce tree, he jumped up, gripping the rough bark and scrambling to climb. But before he could pull himself fully up, his right leg dangled too low. The grizzly saw its opportunity, a flash of agony. Evans felt the bear's teeth sink deep behind his knee. With terrifying strength, the sow ripped him off the tree and flung him 6 feet through the air. His body hit the ground hard. Before he could react, the grizzly latched onto his side and threw all 250 pounds of him like a rag doll. And just like that, the fight for his life was far from over. Jeremy Evans had always heard the same advice: if a grizzly attacks, play dead. So as the massive sow knocked him to the ground, he curled up into a fetal position, hoping the bear would lose interest. But as he lay there, unmoving, the bear didn't stop. The grizzly's jaws locked around the entire left side of his head, clamping down with crushing force. Playing dead was supposed to work, but how could anyone stay still with a grizzly chewing on their face? That's when survival kicked in. Jeremy fought back with everything he had. He punched the bear, grabbed its ears, jabbed at its eyes, anything to make it let go. He shoved his fingers deep into its nostrils, then rammed his hand into its mouth, making it gag. But the bear kept attacking. Evans lashed out blindly, swinging at its belly. His hands grabbed onto something unfamiliar. He didn't know what it was, but he twisted and yanked hard. Finally, the grizzly squealed in pain and bolted into the trees. Jeremy collapsed, his chest heaving, his body torn apart. But the fight wasn't over. Shaking, Evans crawled toward his backpack. He needed to assess the damage. With trembling fingers, he grabbed his phone and took a selfie to see the extent of his injuries. The screen stared back in horror. Half his face was missing. His left eye was gone, his skin torn in bloody ribbons. Still, he wasn't done yet. He reached for his 10mm Glock, thinking about getting back to his hunt. He was in shock, his brain refusing to process the agony tearing through his body. His right leg was useless, the tendon severed, his inner thigh missing a chunk of flesh. Then, something even worse happened. Jeremy felt his whole body go numb. His hands dropped to his sides. He couldn't move. And that's when the bear came back. A crushing force wrapped around his skull. The grizzly bit down on his head and began dragging him backward up the mountain. Jeremy felt its claws rake across his face, ripping away more flesh, tearing off his right ear. This was it. This was how he was going to die. And strangely, he felt at peace with it. Then, suddenly, his body reconnected. As the bear shifted its position, Evans fell to the ground, and somehow the impact shocked his system back to life. His arms could move again. His eyes were another story. His left eye dangled out of its socket. His right eye? He wasn't even sure it was there anymore. Everything was a blur. The grizzly, now just a dark shadow towering over him. But Evans wasn't done fighting. With one last surge of strength, he grabbed the bear and wrapped his legs around its thick neck, squeezing with everything he had. The bear squealed in agony, and then it ran. Evans collapsed face first into the dirt, his body a mangled wreck. But he was still alive. Jeremy dragged himself downhill, searching for his pack. He tried to reload his gun, but his hands were too weak. As he groped blindly at the ground, he kept grabbing strange objects, chunks of skin, an ear, his own ear. He thought about ending it right there. He raised the Glock to his head, but it didn't fire. Maybe that was a sign. He started pressing pieces of skin back onto his skull, wrapping them in his sweater to hold himself together. Then he stumbled and tumbled, falling hundreds of feet down a rocky slope. Lying there, broken and bleeding, Evans felt himself slipping away. And then his fingers brushed against his phone. He blindly tapped at the screen, unable to see what he was doing. Suddenly, a sound filled the silence. Baby Shark do-do-do-do-do-do. It was his daughter's favorite song, the one he played whenever she was sick or crying. And in that moment, Jeremy Evans knew he couldn't die. Not here, not like this. He had to survive, for her, and so he crawled on. With nothing but sheer willpower, he began crawling again. Every inch was agony. His body wasn't working. His legs were useless, his head barely held together, his hands weak. He was bleeding out, alone in the wilderness, barely clinging to life. Yet he kept moving. At some point, Evans stumbled upon an outfitter's camp. Hope surged. He ripped through the place searching for a radio or a satellite phone. Nothing. But he did find toilet paper and tape, just enough to wrap his head and jaw to keep what was left of his face from falling apart. Then, he found something even more valuable: juice boxes. The sugar hit his bloodstream like fuel to a dying fire. Before leaving, he scribbled a note. Sorry for the mess. Please tell my wife, Joyce, I love her. Then he kept crawling. Evans crawled for over 7 miles. 7 miles of pure suffering. By the time he reached his truck, he was barely alive. But he wasn't stopping now. Through blurred vision and unimaginable pain, he drove another 13 miles until he spotted a small family-owned lodge. When he stumbled inside, the first person to see him was a 9-year-old boy. The child's scream echoed through the room. He thought it was a cruel joke, a Halloween monster come to life. But Evans forced out words, trying to explain the nightmare he had just survived. The lodge owner was a pilot. He immediately agreed to fly Evans to the hospital. As they waited for the helicopter, Evans, mangled, bleeding, barely clinging to life, asked if he could go fishing. The lodge staff didn't let him, of course, But that request alone showed the kind of man he was. Even on the brink of death, Evans still wanted to be in nature, doing what he loved. Evans spent 5 weeks in the hospital. Doctors were certain he wouldn't survive the first night. But he did. Just 2 days after being discharged, he went hunting again. 7 weeks after the attack, he was back at work, his body scarred but his spirit unbroken. Jeremy Evans didn't just survive a grizzly attack. He defied every odd. He later wrote a book about the horrific events of August 24, 2017, sharing the lessons he learned and the mindset that kept him alive. His story stands as one of the most incredible survival tales ever recorded, a testament to resilience, willpower, and the unbreakable bond between a hunter and the wild. October 13, 2018, the hunting season was in full swing. Bob Legasa, a seasoned hunter, had always found solace in the mountains, away from the chaos of modern life. At 57, he had spent a lifetime enjoying the outdoors, drawn to its beauty, and the way it sharpened his senses. The sights, sounds, and smells of nature enchanted him, and the primal instincts of hunting called to him. For Legasa, hunting was more than just a hobby. It was a way to provide for his family, a responsibility he took with pride. In October 2018, Legasa traveled from his home in Hayden, Idaho to Montana with one goal: to hunt elk. This wasn't his first hunting trip. He was accompanied by his friend Greg Gibson, a local guide in Montana. Earlier that month, Legasa, who also worked as a filmmaker, had enlisted Gibson's help for a project. Together, they produced a short video demonstrating the effective use of bear spray. In the video, Gibson shared expert advice with viewers, emphasizing the importance of being aware of one's surroundings while out in bear country. He explained that while bear spray can still work at close range, it is far more effective if deployed early. This allows the spray time to impair the bear's vision and breathing, possibly halting its charge before it makes contact. Both Gibson and Legasa were experienced, and the video reflected their knowledge. They were no novices. Legasa and Gibson arrived at their chosen hunting spot, located near the unincorporated community of Gardner in Park County, Montana, just outside Yellowstone National Park. They set out with the goal of finding a herd of elk, with the challenge of hunting a rutting bull elk in mind, one of the most sought-after prizes for hunters. As they made their way through the area, the two men remained alert, aware that every little change in the environment could signal a potential threat. A hunter's sharp senses are their greatest asset, and while precautions are always necessary in the wilderness, the unexpected can often catch you off guard. While walking through tall sagebrush, Legasa and Gibson suddenly stopped dead in their tracks. Standing just 36 feet away were a 500-pound grizzly sow and her 2-year-old cub. For a moment, all of them, human and bear alike, stood frozen, too shocked to move. But that stillness was shattered when the cub, likely frightened, stood on its haunches and let out a growl. This noise triggered an immediate reaction from the sow. Without warning, the sow charged straight at Bob Legasa. In a flash, Legasa didn't have time to grab his bear spray, but both he and Gibson started shouting loudly in an attempt to scare the bear off. It didn't work. For a split second, Legasa briefly thought that perhaps the bear was just bluffing. However, it quickly became clear that the sow's protective instincts had kicked in, and she was intent on tackling him. Before he could react further, Legasa had a fleeting, almost absurd thought. The bear looked like a football player going in for a tackle. Then, the bear slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The 57-year-old hunter found himself knocked to the ground. In the chaos, Legasa had just enough time to raise his arm to protect his face. However, the grizzly quickly clamped down on his left arm with its powerful jaws, sinking its teeth deep into his flesh. At the same time, The bear's claws began tearing at his face. The animal's only intention seemed to be to maul him, but Legasa wasn't alone in this terrifying moment. Greg Gibson, just a few steps behind, didn't freeze in fear as his friend was attacked. Instead, Gibson quickly drew his bear spray. With one powerful shot, he sprayed the grizzly. The effect was immediate. The bear paused its assault on Legasa. But instead of retreating, the grizzly shifted its attention toward Gibson. Gibson, not backing down, deployed another burst of bear spray, which finally caused both the grizzly and her cub to retreat. Although they were out of immediate danger, Legasa was sure his arm was broken, and both men had taken a hit from the bear spray, partially blinding them and stinging their eyes. Covered in blood and unable to see clearly, they managed to hike out of the area. Legasa would later recall that, despite the mauling, the bear spray's sting was by far the most unbearable part of the ordeal. The backlash was completely unexpected, Legasa recalled. The vulgarity was off the charts. Death threats and all sorts of nasty comments, mostly from people who oppose hunting and from the vegan community. On the other hand, I received a lot of support, but it was definitely overwhelming. Despite the negativity, Legasa remained resolute in his love for hunting. He told reporters, "I'm going to get back out there. Hunting is in my DNA. Being in the mountains is where I belong, and I'm already counting the days until I can hunt again." In February 2019, months after the bear attack, Legasa traveled to New York for an interview with Animal Planet. Despite his concerns that the show might present the story with an anti-hunting bias, he recognized the opportunity to get an important message across. He wanted people to understand that hunting isn't driven by malice, but by many different reasons. Additionally, he emphasized the importance of carrying bear spray as a primary defense. "It's your first line of defense," he said. "It gives you a better option than just relying on a firearm." In Legasa's case, his belief in the effectiveness of bear spray was validated. Had Gibson tried to shoot the bear while it was on top of Legasa, there was a significant risk of hitting Legasa instead. But what do you think? Do you believe a firearm would have been more helpful in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. When a hunter becomes the prey, things can quickly take an unexpected turn. Richard Wesley's black bear hunt took a shocking twist when he inadvertently startled a bear in its own territory. Caught on camera, it was only when Richard later replayed the footage for his family and friends that he realized just how fortunate he had been. The bear, however, wasn't as lucky. Richard Wesley was an experienced hunter, taught by his father, a skilled hunter and trapper in Ontario, Canada. Hunting was something he did regularly, and his ultimate goal was to hunt black bears using only a bow and arrow. He loved the thrill of the hunt, carefully tracking the animal from a distance before quietly moving in for the perfect shot. Though he was skilled, Richard never gave much thought to the dangers of hunting, particularly the risks of hunting a powerful predator like a bear. His father had taught him not to fear anything, to stand tall and be strong. However, sometimes fear is a helpful companion. It's what keeps you alert and alive. In the spring of 2019, Richard was hunting in northern Ontario. He had rented a cabin and spent his days tracking black bears in the area. Ontario is home to one of the largest black bear populations in North America, with estimates between 75,000 and 100,000 bears. It's a prime destination for bear hunting. Most hunters use high-powered rifles or shotguns with slugs for short-range shots. But Richard, preferring the challenge, had opted to hunt with a bow, a quieter, more traditional method that required greater skill and a closer range to ensure a clean, lethal shot. When Richard left his hunting cabin that morning, he had no idea that the day would take such a dramatic turn. Little did he know, it could be his last walk, his final steps, the last time he would pull back his bow. He set out on foot, determined to track down a black bear. He moved quietly through the pine forests, stopping occasionally to listen for any signs of movement. His destination was a spot he believed was promising for bear activity. Eventually, he reached an open area where the trees had been cleared. Fallen trunks and branches lay scattered across the ground. The sky was overcast with heavy, low-hanging clouds that added to the bleakness of the scene. He knew there was a bear in the area. He'd been tracking it for a while. Then, as he walked along the path, he spotted a black shape in the distance, the unmistakable round form of a large black bear. Richard had finally caught up to it. He was recording the hunt on his GoPro, and the footage shows the bear foraging for berries in the open space. With its head down, it rooted around, oblivious to the danger it was in. Richard carefully slipped off the track and crouched beside some fallen trees. His heart raced in his chest as he waited, knowing he was in a vulnerable position. With little cover, a poorly placed shot could turn this bear into a deadly threat. The bear continued to move, seemingly unaware of Richard's presence, coming closer to Richard's position. He held his breath, watching and waiting for the perfect moment. He knocked an arrow onto his bow, ready to pull back the string at any second. His nerves were steady, but the breeze had picked up, adding a crosswind he had to account for when taking his shot. The bear, still focused on foraging with its head down, suddenly looked up. Less than 20 feet away, it noticed Richard. He immediately realized that this was a dangerous turn of events. Startled, the bear charged at him with incredible speed. Its massive paws hit the ground with thunderous force as it closed the distance. Richard yelled in an attempt to scare it off, but the bear was in full charge. He raised his bow, but it was already too late. As he retreated, Richard tripped over fallen tree trunks and branches, scrambling to escape. In a single leap, the bear cleared the obstacles and was face to face with him. Richard saw the full force of the attack, the bear's claws and teeth closing in. The sheer power of the animal sent him crashing to the ground. Clutching the arrow still in his hand, his only defense, he recalled his father's advice. A bear's nose is its most vulnerable spot. Despite being pinned, Richard managed to jab the arrow a few times into the bear's snout. With a sudden shift, the bear released its grip and jumped off of him. Richard lay still, holding his breath, waiting for the attack to continue. But it never came. The bear, seemingly satisfied, turned and ran towards the tree line. Richard, incredibly fortunate, watched as the bear lumbered away. He had survived. Shaken but largely unharmed, Richard got to his feet and slowly made his way back to the cabin. Aside from a few bruises, he had emerged from this encounter with one of Canada's most formidable predators, relatively unscathed. The rush of adrenaline still pulsing through him, Richard couldn't help but feel thankful. His close call with death had ended in his favor. After showing his family the video footage, Richard realized just how fortunate he had been. His wife, overcome with emotion, broke into tears, and his father's face showed pure concern, almost in shock. Richard had casually described the attack to them, brushing it off as just another part of his hunting experience. But as he rewatched the footage and saw his family's reaction, it finally hit him how narrowly he had escaped danger. This close call brought a new sense of appreciation for life. Richard began holding his loved ones a little tighter, cherishing every moment more than before, and he no longer took things for granted. However, the story wasn't over for Richard. The bear, though merely protecting its territory and reacting out of surprise, left a mark on him. Richard, determined to seek closure, chose to return to the same spot. Though still shaken by the encounter, he decided to take a different approach this time and shot from a tree stand. Recognizing the bear by a distinctive white scar above its eye, Richard waited until it was in range. With steady hands, he raised his bow and fired. The bear fell, and Richard completed the task he had originally set out to do. 26-year-old Chase Dellwo took a hunting trip with his brother on Saturday, October 3, 2015. It was a trip that would change their lives forever. The two of them carried their bows to an area of rugged wilderness northwest of Choteau, Montana. They were on the hunt for elk. The weather was terrible. It was going to be a challenging day, but just how challenging they were about to find out. The wind was blowing 30 to 40 miles per hour. It was driving the rain and snow across the landscape. The visibility was quite poor, and making a successful shot was going to be difficult. But first, the brothers had to find the elk. They hiked through the trees and over the rocky landscape until they came to a ridge. It was the perfect viewing position, and sure enough, down below them there was a herd of elk. They were grazing the grassland along a river drainage system, unaware that the hunters were looking down on them. But there was no way Chase or Shane could make a shot from that distance. So, they came up with a plan. Chase scrambled down the ridge, making his way behind the elk herd. He would then drive them up towards where his brother was lying in wait. There were plenty of fine individuals that would be considered trophy elk, and he was excited about what the day might bring. It was the perfect opportunity for bagging a decent-sized animal. They were horrible conditions to be out and about in, but they also had many benefits. The elk were less likely to see or hear him coming, and they wouldn't pick up his scent either. He clutched his bow by his side. An arrow was nocked, placed on the bowstring, ready to be shot. Then he heard a bull elk bugle. He quickened his pace, hoping to usher the herd towards his brother before they moved off on their own. But unbeknown to him, he was walking towards danger. Something was hidden in the tall grass. As he walked towards the herd, something caught his eye. Suddenly, Chase froze. He had inadvertently walked straight into the path of a sleeping bear. Chase held his breath and immediately backed away. He had walked to within 3 feet of the animal, neither of them aware of the other's presence. The howling wind had silenced Chase's footsteps, and his scent had been blown in the opposite direction. In those heart-pounding seconds, Chase hoped the bear wouldn't wake up. He stepped backwards 3 steps, but to his horror, the bear stirred and opened its eyes. It had smelt Chase and come to its senses. It immediately leapt to its feet and charged at Chase. It was so quick that Chase didn't even have time to draw his bow. He knew the hit was coming and braced himself. The bear struck him like a freight train, and Chase was sent crashing to the cold, wet ground. The wind was knocked from his lungs. The bear pounced on top of the 26-year-old and immediately bit down on his head. Chase could feel the pressure. It felt as though his skull was about to crack. There was nothing he could do. He tried to fight back, but he was pinned to the ground underneath 400 pounds of muscle. The bear let go, but remained standing over the young man. It then let out a roar that shook Chase to the core. Moments later, it stepped away and Chase sat up. But the bear wheeled around and came for him again. Chase was dizzied and dazed from the attack. This time, the bear ran at him with its mouth open. Chase saw the immense, characteristic hump on its shoulder. He saw the shaggy brown fur bouncing on its body as it galloped towards him. Water droplets sprayed from the animal's enormous face. The eyes were fixed on his own. The power of the beast was humbling. Chase had no chance against it. Or did he? As he was being thrown from side to side each time the bear shook its powerful jaws, a memory popped into Chase's head. It was a magazine article that his grandmother had shown him many years ago. It claimed that large animals have big gag reflexes. It was worth a shot. Lying on his back whilst the bear mauled him and shook him, Chase bravely leant forwards and shoved his arm down the bear's throat. The bear immediately let go and reeled backwards. Chase watched as the animal thundered away across the drainage and towards the tree line. Chase could finally breathe. He sat there for a few stunned moments, not quite believing what had happened to him. He wiped his eyes and looked down at his leg. It was torn and in tatters. He had to get out of there and get medical attention right away. He looked towards the ridge for his brother, but he couldn't see him. He had to walk across the uneven ground to find Shane. Every step was now agony. He was battered and bruised, and he didn't know how badly injured he was. It was impossible to tell. But as the pain began intensifying, he began to panic. He stopped, taking deep breaths, trying to calm himself down. He knew panicking was the worst thing he could do in that situation. He had to try and keep his cool, think clearly, and get the help he needed. After trekking along the drainage for some time, he spotted a 6-point elk. That could have been his if he hadn't stumbled upon the bear. But this was no time to be thinking about what might have been. He looked up towards the ridge. There he saw his brother, still crouched in position, waiting for the elk to come his way. Chase raised his bow above his head and waved at Shane. At first, Shane assumed his younger brother had tagged an elk, so he scrambled down the ridge towards him. Only when he got closer did he see Chase's blood-covered face and torn-up leg. He rushed to his side. He immediately checked him over, lifting up his shirt to see if he had any deep lacerations on his torso. When he realized that no arteries had been severed, the two of them rushed to their vehicle. Shane took the wheel and raced along the tracks to the open road. Benefice Teton Medical Center was 20 minutes drive away, and Shane pushed the pedal to the floor, knowing that every minute counted. He phoned ahead, and when they arrived, staff were waiting for them. They immediately got to work on Chase. He was pumped full of antibiotics to stave off any potential infection. He received staples and stitches to his head and face. His left eye was swollen, and his leg bore deep puncture wounds which would take time to heal. Chase knew he wouldn't have had time to dispense bear spray if he had been carrying it, and he doubted whether it would have been effective in such strong wind either. But he still advises others to carry bear spray with them when they are heading out into the wilderness, something he will be doing next time he is out. Chase held no grudge against the bear. He knew that the bear was just as afraid and just as startled as he was. And it could have ended him then and there, but it didn't. It had no desire to kill him, only to neutralize the threat. Chase sat out the rest of the bow hunting season that year, but with hunting in his blood, he knew he'd be back the following season. Owen Miller is a hunting specialist. His weapon of choice is more unique than others. He started off hunting with his rifle, then he turned to a compound bow, and then he found his ultimate challenge, using a recurve bow. There was something about a recurve bow that excited Owen. It made the hunt harder and more challenging. It was a more traditional way of hunting. It requires more skill, depending on who you ask, and means you have to get a lot closer to the animal for the perfect shot. The challenge of a recurve bow comes with its more primal setup. It doesn't have sights, and it also doesn't have a compound bow's pulley system. This system allows a bow hunter to pull the string back and hold it for a prolonged period of time before releasing the arrow. This means that you can ready the bow, aim at the target, and only then release the arrow. But for recurve bows, it's more simply a case of drawing and shooting in one single motion. There is no room for error. But Owen's fussiness over his specific weapon of choice doesn't end there. He is also picky about the arrows he uses. He doesn't like the modern ones that have 4 or more cutting blades. He doesn't think they look traditional. So instead, he opts for arrows with triangle-shaped broadheads with 2 cutting edges. Using this more traditional hunting weapon and technique, Owen had to practice a lot. In fact, it took him more than 2 years before he felt confident enough to use the recurve bow on a real hunt. Teaching himself exactly when to pull back the string and his positioning for the perfect shot was an art form. Owen was no stranger to hunting. He had made many kills before. He had taken down bears, elk, and mule and white-tailed deer. For these, he had used his rifle or compound bow. For Owen, it was always about the thrill of the hunt, not about the size of the animal or the big trophy hunts. He just wanted to be in the great outdoors, seeking adventure. But there was a beast in his favorite hunting ground in southern Wyoming. It was almost of mythical proportions. It was a cinnamon-colored male black bear, and it was huge. Owen and his brother had seen it on a number of hunting trips, but they had always failed to shoot it. Somehow, it always evaded capture. It was like a ghost amongst the trees, disappearing from the sights, slinking away into the bushes before either of them could secure a shot. They would just catch a glimpse of it before it vanished for the rest of the hunting season. In the fall of 2023, Owen's brother stood patiently in a stand waiting for the mysterious bear to make an appearance. When he saw a head emerging from the undergrowth, he pulled his trigger, but it wasn't the cinnamon-colored bear he had hoped for, and the brothers couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. They would have to wait until the spring hunting season for their next shot at the elusive beast. Towards the end of May, Owen had a wedding to attend near his favorite hunting ground. He decided to combine a hunting trip whilst he was in the area. He baited the ground near a hunting stand before attending the wedding. When he came back, all the bait had been taken, so he resupplied it. Then he waited in the stand with his trusty recurve bow. It wasn't long before he heard a rustle in the surrounding undergrowth. Something beige appeared below him. He knew it wasn't a bear right away, and so grabbed his camera instead of his bow. To his surprise, it was a mountain lion. Owen didn't know what it was going to do. He wasn't far off the ground, and if the mountain lion decided to attack, he could be in trouble. But it walked right underneath him without glancing up. Owen held his breath as he watched the big cat sniff the ground where the bait lay and then disappear off into the distance. It was an incredible encounter that had made the wait worth it. Owen would have been happy if his hunting trip had ended there, but he was in for yet another surprise, one he had been waiting many years for. Owen wasn't expecting to see any bears that day. He had disturbed the bait, resupplied it, and hadn't long been in the tree stand. He knew from experience that usually it took bears a good few days to return to a disturbed spot, but he decided to wait a little longer to see if anything showed up. Then, at around 7 p.m., he saw it, the cinnamon-colored black bear. It was an incredible specimen, and it was completely unaware of Owen's presence. It must have determined that there was no danger and come to investigate. Owen couldn't believe his eyes. He wished his brother there with him now to witness the spectacle. It was tempting to take the shot right away. He had waited so long for this moment, but it had to be right. He couldn't risk injuring the bear and letting it get away. Patience was key with recurve bow hunting. He knew with the recurve bow, the positioning had to be perfect straight away. And so, he waited a little longer. He silently picked up his bow, ready to make the shot. Then, the bear walked a little closer to the stand, lifted his head, and stared up at Owen. Their eyes met briefly, and Owen knew that this was his chance. In an instant, he drew the bow and let it go in one swift movement. The shot was as perfect as they come. The arrow struck the bear side on and pierced both lungs. It was a powerful and immediately fatal shot, and the bear was dead within seconds. Owen had done it. He had taken the cinnamon-colored black bear he had wanted for so long, and he had used his recurve bow. It could not have been a more perfect hunt. His patience had paid off, and the last 2 years of mastering the recurve bow was worth it. The sun had now set in the sky, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. Owen had to be quick to process the carcass, but the bear must have weighed around 400 pounds. It was a huge job for one person, and it was around 1:30 in the morning before he hauled the first load of meat to his truck. Under Wyoming hunting regulations, black bears are classified as a trophy game species, which means that hunters aren't required to keep the meat. But Owen didn't agree with that. If you are going to take the life of an animal, you should make the most of it. He loved bear meat and intended to use as much as possible. He rendered down the fat for cooking oil and to use as waterproofing for hiking boots. When Owen hauled the skin and skull of the bear back home, his friends couldn't believe just how massive the bear had been. They were sure that Owen had set some kind of record, but Owen has always been reluctant to chase records and make trophy shots. That's not why he hunts. But after a lot of persuasion from his friends, he considered getting the bear measured officially by a certified Boone and Crockett score. Even though he had already processed the bear and waited a long time before considering getting the bear scored, he hadn't lost his chance. Because the official scoring is done by measuring the bear's skull, and that can only be done once it's gone through the mandatory drying period. This meant that Owen could still have a record-winning bear on his hands. Although the size of the animal was not Owen's goal, he couldn't help but wonder exactly how big his bear was compared to others that had been harvested. So he unofficially measured the skull himself, and it came out at 21 1/16 inches, which would mean that it's the 8th largest black bear ever taken in the state of Wyoming. What's your opinion on hunting with a bow? Please share your comments below. Thank you for watching and stay safe. In September 2021, Ryan had drawn a coveted elk tag for an area just outside Yellowstone National Park. It was a dream hunt, one he had been preparing for all year. The South Dakota native had been elk hunting since 2016, traveling to Colorado for past seasons. But this time was different. Elk hunting in Wyoming meant one extra layer of danger: bears. Grizzlies were known to follow the sound of gunshots, hoping to steal a hunter's kill. Ryan wasn't taking any chances. He carried a Seekins Precision Havoc Pro Hunter II, known for its accuracy, durability, and high-end craftsmanship. He had considered carrying a sidearm, but after extensive research, he decided he wanted a rifle that could drop a bear with one well-placed shot. He had practiced all summer, ensuring he was fast, accurate, and ready for anything. Luke, an experienced outdoorsman himself, joined Ryan for safety. Bear encounters were rare, but when they happened fast. Having a second set of eyes and a second firearm was the best precaution they could take. The first day of their hunt was uneventful. They saw plenty of elk sign, but the animals were staying hidden. At dawn on day 2, the hunters moved deeper into the backcountry, hoping to locate a herd. The thick pine forest was filled with wildlife, but it wasn't elk that caught their attention. It was fresh bear scat. The massive pile was still steaming, a clear sign that a grizzly had been in the area just minutes before. Ryan and Luke exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen bear sign before, but this felt too close for comfort. Still, they pressed on, moving cautiously through the timber. Then, everything changed. A deep, guttural huff echoed through the trees. Ryan barely had time to react before a massive grizzly bear exploded from the underbrush, charging at them at full speed. 20 yards. The bear was a freight train of muscle and fury, moving faster than seemed possible for something so big. Its claws dug into the earth, tearing up dirt as it barreled toward them. Luke shouted, "Bear!" but Ryan's instincts had already taken over. He grabbed his Havoc Pro Hunter II, his body moving before his mind had time to process the danger. 15 yards. The bear's eyes were locked onto him. 10 yards. This was life or death. Ryan took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and pulled the trigger. The bullet slammed into the bear's skull, just above its left eye. The impact was devastating. The bear's momentum carried it forward, but then, suddenly, it collapsed. A dead stop. The record-breaking grizzly slid across the dirt, stopping just a few feet from Ryan and Luke. Silence. Neither man moved. They just stared at the bear, their hearts hammering in their chests. Luke was the first to speak. "One shot," Ryan exhaled, his hands shaking from adrenaline. "One shot." They radioed for help, knowing they needed to report the incident to Wyoming Game and Fish authorities. When the officials arrived, they were stunned. The grizzly was one of the largest ever recorded in Wyoming, weighing a staggering 1,100 pounds. The wardens commended Ryan's shot, stating that one clean hit to the skull had saved both of their lives. Most people never survive a full-speed grizzly charge. As they packed up camp the next morning, Luke admitted something. "I thought we were dead." Ryan nodded. "If I missed, we would have been." The Wyoming wilderness had tested them, and in a split second, a single shot had made all the difference. Would they return? Absolutely. The Wyoming backcountry isn't for the weak. Out here, you don't get second chances. Josh Carter and Ethan Rhodes knew that. They'd hunted these mountains for years, tracking elk through rough country, dealing with whatever nature threw at them. But nothing, not a bad storm, not a bull with a bad attitude, could prepare them for what was coming. They had their rifles, their gear, and their instincts. But in grizzly country, sometimes that ain't enough. The plan was simple. Get up high, glass for elk, and put some miles on their boots. By mid-morning, they stumbled onto a fresh kill. Not just any kill. The rib cage was ripped open, meat still steaming in the cool air. Josh felt his gut tighten. This ain't good. Ethan crouched down, running his fingers over the dirt. Big bear, fresh tracks. That's when they heard it. A deep rolling huff, the kind that sinks into your bones and tells you you're in trouble. There wasn't time to think. The grizzly exploded out of the trees, closing the distance fast, a freight train of muscle and teeth. Josh's hand flew to his rifle, but the bear was already too close. 15 yards. 10. The ground shook under its weight. "Climb!" Ethan yelled. Josh didn't argue. He dropped everything and ran for the closest pine, digging his boots into the bark, scrambling up as fast as he could. Ethan was right behind him, his hands burning as he clawed his way higher. The bear hit the tree like a wrecking ball, shaking it hard enough to nearly knock them loose. They were trapped, and the bear wasn't leaving. For what felt like an hour, the grizzly circled below, pacing, grunting, watching. Josh's arms burned from hanging on. His rifle was still strapped to his back, useless. Then came the moment they had dreaded. The bear started climbing. Josh felt the branches creak under his weight as he shifted, finally getting a grip on his rifle. The grizzly was clawing its way up, eyes locked on him. No time to second guess. Josh threw the rifle to his shoulder, his pulse hammering. The bear was almost in his face. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger. The Remington 700 boomed, the shot hitting dead center. The grizzly jerked, its massive frame going stiff. Then it let go. The thud it made when it hit the ground shook the whole damn forest. Silence. Neither of them moved. The bear was down, blood pooling under its massive body. Ethan finally let out a breath. Jesus! Josh climbed down, legs shaking. He nudged the bear's lifeless frame with his boot. Biggest damn bear I've ever seen! The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you grateful for every layer of fabric between you and the wind. Luke Harris and Jake Nolan had spent the entire day trekking through the remote backcountry of British Columbia, hunting elk. The terrain had been rugged, the trails barely there, but it was worth it. They had seen fresh tracks, heard distant bugles, and were convinced tomorrow would be the day they got their bull. Tired and satisfied, they set up camp near a quiet stream, far from any roads, deep in grizzly country. They ate by the fire, talking about past hunts and the thrill of the chase, before finally crawling into their tent. Their rifles were propped against a tree just outside, their Glock 20 tucked away for safety inside the tent. The wind howled softly through the trees. They never heard it coming. Luke woke to a deafening roar and the tent collapsing around them. For a split second, he was still half asleep, confused, disoriented. Then came the screams, raw, agonized, terrifying. Jake. Something huge and heavy was thrashing inside the tent, ripping fabric, knocking over their gear. Luke barely had time to roll away before he felt the weight shift off him. Then he saw the shape of the bear in the dim light, dragging Jake through the shredded remains of their tent. Jake was kicking, punching, fighting for his life, but he was no match for the 900-pound grizzly that had him in its jaws, hands shaking, desperately feeling for his Glock. He could hear the bear snarling, its teeth tearing into Jake, the horrifying sound of bones snapping. Then, the screaming stopped. Jake was gone. The bear lifted its head from Jake's lifeless body, steam rising from its mouth in the cold air. And then, it turned toward Luke. Its eyes locked on him, and it charged. Luke had no time to think, just react. Boom! The first shot slammed into the bear's chest, but the beast didn't even flinch. It just kept coming, faster, deadlier. Luke kept firing. Every shot landed, but the grizzly was too big, too strong, too enraged. It wasn't stopping. Luke backpedaled fast, nearly tripping over a fallen log. He fired again, but the bear was almost on him now, jaws wide, ready to end him. He had one shot left. Luke aimed at its head, just below the eye. Boom! The bear staggered, took one more step, then collapsed. It hit the ground just feet from where he stood. Luke stood frozen, gun still aimed, hands shaking uncontrollably. The bear was enormous, over 900 pounds of pure muscle and fury, one of the biggest grizzlies ever recorded in the area. It had taken 7 direct hits to bring it down. Then his eyes drifted to Jake. His best friend lay lifeless in the dirt, his body torn apart. The wilderness had taken its price. The night stretched on in eerie silence. Luke stayed by the fire, Glock still in his grip, watching the trees, waiting for dawn. By the time help arrived the next morning, Luke was still sitting there, staring at the monster that had almost killed him. They had come to hunt. Instead, they had become the hunted. The plan was simple. 2 hunters, 1 mission. Take down a grizzly. Ethan Wells and Matt Lawson had spent months preparing for this trip. They weren't amateurs. They had hunted elk, mule deer, and black bears. But this was different. This was a grizzly hunt, and they had decided to do it with only handguns. Their Glock 20s. Some would call it reckless. They called it a challenge. For days, they had been tracking their prey deep in the wilderness of Alaska's Wrangell Mountains. The bear sign was everywhere. Fresh tracks in the damp earth, massive claw marks raking the bark of trees, the pungent, musky scent of a grizzly lingering in the air. They knew the bear was close. Adrenaline pumped through their veins. This was the moment they had been waiting for. What they didn't know was that this grizzly wouldn't go down easy, and one of them wouldn't make it home. The air was still. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a raven. Then, Matt froze. His eyes locked on something beyond the tree line, a massive shadow shifting in the undergrowth. "Ethan," he whispered, not moving. "There." Ethan followed his line of sight, and his breath caught. The grizzly was enormous, easily 900 pounds, towering over the brush like a nightmare. It hadn't seen them yet. It was sniffing the air, moving slow, unaware that death was lurking nearby. Matt's fingers tightened around his Glock. "Take the shot," Ethan whispered. Matt exhaled, steadying his hands. Then he squeezed the trigger. The 10mm round struck the bear in the shoulder. It let out a guttural roar, spinning toward them, its eyes burning with fury. "Hit it again!" Ethan yelled. Matt fired again. The bullets connected, one in the ribs, one near the chest. For a moment, the bear staggered. They thought it was going down. They were dead wrong. The bear wasn't done. It turned on them, its muscles rippling beneath its thick fur, its breath heaving in rage. And then it charged. The ground shook under its weight. Matt fired again. Nothing stopped it. It was still coming. Ethan turned and sprinted toward the trees, hearing Matt's gun go off behind him. The bear was only seconds away. Matt was running too, but he was slower. And that was all it took. The grizzly slammed into him with full force. Matt's scream echoed through the valley as he was sent sprawling to the ground. The Glock flew from his hand. Before Ethan could react, he heard the sickening crunch of teeth sinking into flesh. Ethan had no choice. Blood soaked the ground. Ethan's mind raced. He had to do something. With shaking hands, he pulled his Glock from its holster. The bear lifted its head, Matt's blood dripping from its muzzle. Ethan took aim. Boom! The first shot missed. The bear turned toward him, those dead black eyes locking onto his. It charged the tree. Ethan fired again. One bullet struck its jaw. The bear staggered but didn't stop. It clawed at the tree, roaring in fury. Ethan aimed one last time. Boom! The bullet tore through the bear's skull. It collapsed, letting out a deep, shuddering breath. And then, silence. Ethan dropped from the tree and ran to Matt. He was barely breathing. His face was pale, his body torn. The bear had done too much damage. Ethan fell to his knees, pressing his hands over the wounds, trying to stop the bleeding. But deep down, he knew it was too late. Matt's eyes fluttered open. He looked at Ethan, trying to speak, but no words came. And then, he was gone. The sun was setting, casting a dim orange glow over the valley. The world felt too quiet. Ethan sat there staring at the body of his best friend. He had come here for a hunt, but he was leaving alone. The next morning, a rescue team arrived. They retrieved Matt's body and confirmed what Ethan already knew. This bear was a record-sized grizzly, over 1,000 pounds, one of the largest ever taken down in the area. But there was no victory in it. This hunt had taken more than just a trophy. It had taken a life. Ethan never went bear hunting again. He had already faced the deadliest predator of all. The cold Saskatchewan wind cut through Mark Lawson's jacket, and the vast Canadian wilderness stretched endlessly before him. Silent, untouched, and unforgiving. Mark had hunted all his life. At 42, he had taken down moose, elk, and even black bears. But today, his target was something different. Wild boar. Saskatchewan's feral hog problem was growing. These invasive super pigs, a crossbreed of European wild boar and domestic swine, were wreaking havoc on farmland, destroying crops and spreading disease. Some had grown to massive sizes, well over 300 pounds, and they had no fear of humans. Mark had heard the stories. Boar charging hunters, taking bullets and still running, attacking even after they were shot. He wasn't one to scare easily, but he knew these animals weren't to be underestimated. That's why he had chosen his trusted .308 Winchester for the hunt. Mark had used many different calibers over the years, but he always came back to the .308 Winchester. It was powerful, accurate, and reliable. Larger calibers like .300 Winchester Magnum packed more punch, but Mark wanted something he could shoot quickly and accurately. The .308 was perfect. It could drop a 250-pound boar with a well-placed shot while still allowing for follow-up shots if needed. He never imagined that today he'd need every shot he had. The morning had been slow. Mark and his hunting partner, Chris, had tracked fresh boar prints for hours, but they hadn't seen anything. Then, just past a clearing near the edge of the forest, they found it. A massive wild boar stood motionless near a frozen creek, its dark, bristly fur blending into the shadows. Its small black eyes fixed on them, unblinking. Mark's pulse quickened. This was the biggest one they'd seen all season, easily 275 pounds, maybe more. He slowly raised his rifle, centering the crosshairs just behind its front leg. A clean heart-lung shot. One bullet should be enough. He exhaled. The .308 roared through the silent forest. The boar dropped instantly. Mark felt a surge of relief. A perfect shot. It was over. Or so he thought. Mark lowered his rifle and stepped forward. The boar wasn't moving. Then, a deep, guttural snort filled the air. Before Mark could react, the boar exploded off the ground. Blood sprayed from its wound, but the animal didn't care. Its eyes burned with fury, and in an instant, It charged straight at him. Mark tried to raise his rifle, but it was too late. The 275-pound beast slammed into him, knocking him off his feet. The force was like getting hit by a sledgehammer. Pain shot through his leg as razor-sharp tusks tore into his thigh, ripping deep into muscle. Then, the worst-case scenario. The boar's tusk had severed his femoral artery. Mark gasped, his vision blurring. He reached for his radio, hands shaking. "I need help! I'm hit!" Chris, still 100 yards away, heard the panic in his voice. He sprinted toward the sound, rifle in hand. Mark knew he was in serious trouble. He had minutes, maybe seconds, before he bled out. The boar circled back, ready for another attack. Through sheer instinct, Mark reached for his knife. The moment the boar lunged, he plunged the blade deep into its neck. But it wasn't done. Mark struggled to keep pressure on his wound. His hands were slick with blood. He was dizzy, fading fast. Then Chris took a shot. Chris's rifle cracked through the cold air. The shot hit the boar in the head, dropping it instantly. Chris ran to Mark's side, pressing down hard on the wound. "Stay with me, man. Help's coming." Chris grabbed his radio. "We need a medevac now! He's losing too much blood!" Mark barely survived. By the time the rescue team arrived, he was unconscious, his body freezing, blood loss severe. It took 2 hours to get him to the nearest hospital. He woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, stitches running up his leg. Chris sat beside him, shaking his head. "You almost didn't make it," he said. Mark let out a weak chuckle. "Damn pig didn't want to die." Chris smirked. "Neither did you." Mark had been hunting for over 20 years. He knew the rules, but in that moment, he had broken the biggest one. Never assume a wild boar is dead until you're absolutely sure. Always keep your rifle ready, because if the boar still moves, the hunt isn't over. A group of hunters moved carefully through the deep snow, rifles in hand, searching for wild hogs. But in an instant, the hunt flipped on its head. From over the hill, a stampede of wild boars charged straight at them. The men had weapons, but panic took over. Instead of shooting, they ran. What happened next was pure chaos. With people running everywhere, the last thing anyone wanted was to fire their gun and accidentally hit a friend. And even if they had tried to shoot, it may not have helped. The boars knew this land better than the hunters did. Looking at the ground, you could see that the animals had worn down paths through the snow. This was their territory. They were fast, strong, and ready for a fight. While the hunters struggled to move in the deep snow, the boars ran right through it with ease. The hunters screamed, trying to scare the boars away. Some waved their arms, hoping to turn them around, but it didn't work. The boars weren't afraid. They were charging full speed and nothing was stopping them. Then, the worst happened. Some of the hunters got knocked over. The wild pigs slammed into them like bowling balls hitting pins, sending them crashing into the snow. For anyone who thinks wild boars are just farm pigs, this was proof that they are something else entirely. These animals were strong, aggressive, and completely fearless. And even after all of this, not a single hunter fired their gun. Watching from home, it's easy to wonder, why didn't they just fire a warning shot? But in the moment, things are different. When you're suddenly being charged by a pack of wild animals, you don't always think clearly. Maybe they thought the boars would pass by without hurting anyone. Maybe they were afraid of hitting each other in the chaos. Maybe they were just too shocked to react. But one thing was clear. Nothing they tried was working. The boars weren't backing down. And the hunters? They were completely helpless. Most hunters walk into the woods believing they are in control. They have the guns, the experience, the tactics, but nature doesn't care about any of that. That day, the boars took over. They flipped the hunt upside down, and they reminded everyone of one simple rule. Out here, you're just another animal, and when the wild fights back, you'd better be ready. 5 hunters moved cautiously through the landscape, their rifles ready, eyes scanning the tall cornfields. Among them was 72-year-old Jurgen C., a man who had spent over 4 decades hunting these lands. He knew every trail, every hiding spot, and every trick in the book. But on this evening, the hunt wouldn't go as planned. Jurgen spotted the boar first, a massive, muscular beast, tearing through a cornfield, gorging on the farmer's crops. His hunting partner, Erhard H., explained their mission simply. The wild boars eat the corn. That's why we kill them. Jurgen raised his rifle, aimed, and fired. The bullet struck the boar's backside, but the shot wasn't fatal. The wounded animal let out a guttural squeal and bolted back into the towering cornfields. The hunters knew what had to be done. They couldn't leave a wounded boar to suffer, or to escape and become even more dangerous. Without hesitation, Jurgen sent in his terrier, Ben. The small dog darted into the dense stalks, barking wildly. Another hunter, Torsten P., followed close behind, pushing through the thick vegetation. Then came a scream. The men turned in time to see Torsten stumbling out of the field, blood soaking through his pants. His leg had been torn open, a deep, jagged slash from the boar's razor-sharp tusk. He was brought to the hospital in Potsdam, Erhard recalled. Most men would have stopped there. They had already lost one hunter to the beast's fury. But Jurgen wasn't like most men. At 72 years old, he was as tough as they came. He had hunted for nearly half a century, faced countless wild animals, and always came out on top. He wasn't about to let an injured boar outsmart him. As the remaining hunters regrouped, waiting for darkness to settle in, Jurgen made a fatal mistake, one that no one noticed until it was too late. He had gone into the cornfield alone. The group only realized Jurgen was missing when they heard his voice, but this time it wasn't a shout of triumph. "Help!" The hunters rushed into the field, pushing through the dense stalks until they found him. Jurgen was on the ground, blood pooling beneath him. The boar had attacked with full force, its curved tusk slashing straight into his leg, severing an artery near his knee. Erhard did everything he could. He wrapped the wound, tried to stop the bleeding, but Jurgen was slipping away fast. His skin turned pale, his breathing slowed, and before help could arrive, the man who had spent a lifetime hunting had become the hunted. He died there, in the very field he had roamed for decades. The hunters were shaken, but they weren't done. They tracked the boar, following the trail of blood and destruction it left behind. When they found it, there was no hesitation. The beast was brought down. Its massive body now hangs in a cooling room, a trophy of vengeance. A grim reminder that in the wild, the hunter and the hunted can switch places in an instant. On Sunday, September 1st, 2024, best mates Riley Hill and Braxton Myers headed to the Caribou-Targhee National Forest in southeastern Idaho for some elk hunting. Little did they know that it ended up being a hunt like no other. Braxton's 17-year-old brother, Boone, and his friend jumped into the vehicle with them. And so, they drove around half an hour up the Continental Divide Trail from US Highway 20 until they came to Schoolhouse Ridge. It was the perfect location to spot elk from. Boone and his friend climbed out of the vehicle whilst Riley and Braxton continued along the trail a little way. They pulled up, grabbed their bows, and began hiking along a small canyon. They had set some trail cameras a couple of weeks before and had seen several elk, so they were hopeful that it was going to be a successful hunt. They didn't expect what happened next. Riley trod quietly along the path with Braxton a few yards behind. They had spotted a clearing up ahead. It was early morning, 7:20 a.m., the perfect time to spot some elk. Silently, the two friends stepped forward, peering beyond the trees. But before they could see what was in the clearing, they heard a loud thud and then a crack of branches. Something big was coming. They had inadvertently disturbed the king of the hill. This was a 20-year-old grizzly bear who had dominated the area for so long he had earned himself a reputation. He had hunted cattle on the surrounding farms and destroyed property nearby. He was enormous and he was dominant, and the two young men had startled him just as he was settling down in his daybed. With one ear torn off from a previous fight, the king of the hill hadn't heard Riley and Braxton approaching until they were almost upon him. He thundered out of the undergrowth, appearing from nowhere. All Braxton had time to do was to shout, "Bear!" to alert Riley. His pistol was in a concealed holster. He didn't have time to pull it out, but he knew that Riley might be able to get a shot in if he lured the bear away from his friend. With the bear just a foot away from him, in full charge and about to lunge on top of him, Braxton turned and sprinted as fast as he could back along the trail away from Riley. But he only made it a few feet before he tripped and fell to the ground. Riley had seen the bear careering out of the trees and launching itself at his best friend. In one swift movement, he dropped his bow and immediately yanked his 10mm Springfield from its holster and fired at the bear. The bullet struck the animal in its right side. It immediately stopped and glared at Riley. Riley then watched in horror as the bear bounded towards him. With the bear charging down, Riley managed to squeeze his trigger 3 more times, hitting the bear's face and shoulder. But that didn't stop the beast. It was in full attack mode, and it was stopping at nothing until it had neutralized the threat. At the last second, Riley turned away from the bear to duck behind a tree, but the bear seized his right arm and yanked him backwards with such force that Riley was pulled off his feet. Now, the king of the hill had him in his grip, and he wasn't letting go. Riley screamed out as he was flung from side to side, shaken like a rag doll. He was entirely at the mercy of the king. Braxton was just getting to his feet. For a split second, he couldn't make out what was happening. He had heard Riley's gunshots as the bear chased him, but he had fully expected to feel the bear's sharp teeth and claws devouring him when he tripped and fell. It was unusual for a bear to turn and leave its original target to pursue another one. He scrambled to his feet and his eyes bulged wide when he saw the bear further along the trail. The animal was straddling his best friend. All he could see was Riley's head and shoulders in between the bear's front paws and Riley's legs sticking out from underneath the bear's belly. Seeing his friend like that shook Braxton to the core. He fumbled about for his sidearm and pulled out his Taurus 1911-45 ACP pistol. He immediately began firing at the bear, striking him with each shot. Riley, lying on the cold, hard ground, could feel the bear recoil slightly as the bullet sunk into his body. But the bear kept biting down. He kept ripping and tugging at Riley's arm. There was no let-up until Braxton ran up to the bear and shot it repeatedly at point-blank range. At that moment, the bear loosened its grip on Riley, and he immediately prized open the bear's jaws and ripped his arm out of its mouth. Riley quickly scrambled to his feet. He saw his pistol on the ground and grabbed it, firing 3 more shots into the bear just to make sure it was dead. But Braxton knew they weren't out of the woods yet. Riley had been attacked for just 30 seconds, but it was the longest, most terrifying 30 seconds of his life, and the damage could have been fatal. Braxton could see blood dripping off the end of Riley's right hand, but he didn't know how badly injured he was. Carefully, he helped Riley take off his long-sleeve shirt to assess the damage. That's when they realized that it was bad. The bear had torn and shredded Riley's arm as it hung from his body. Braxton grabbed his belt and tied it tightly around Riley's upper arm. Now, they'd get Riley some urgent medical attention. Braxton dialed 911. His brother, Boone, had heard the gunshots from a mile away. He knew instantly that something bad had happened as they were supposed to be bow hunting, not using their guns. Braxton sent him a pin drop of their location, and Boone sprinted off to find them, covering the distance in just 7 minutes. When he arrived, he was shocked to see the enormous brown bear lying crumpled on the ground and Riley with his arm wrapped in a shirt and 2 belts. The three of them immediately began the uphill hike back to their vehicle. Now the pain started kicking in for Riley. He had been fueled on adrenaline up until that point, but now that was wearing off, and that's not all. Every 15 steps or so, blood poured from his arm. He was worried he was losing too much blood. His heart was pounding in his chest. The hike soon became one of the hardest of his life, but spurred on by his friends, he made it back to the vehicle and they climbed in, scouting an open area for the emergency helicopter to land. It wasn't long before they heard the familiar whirring of the helicopter and it came into view. Riley was airlifted to Eastern Idaho Regional Medical Hospital where he received 40 staples and numerous stitches in his arm. He was lucky that the bear didn't sever an artery. He was even more lucky that his best friend was there to shoot the bear. It took 24 bullets to take down the king of the hill. The two friends felt terrible for killing such an impressive creature who had roamed that region for 2 decades, but in the end, it was him or them. In September 2021, Daniel and Ethan arrived in Wyoming, excited for the elk hunt of a lifetime. The two had been hunting together for years, but this trip was special. Daniel had drawn a rare elk tag for a unit just outside of Yellowstone, and he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. The South Dakota native had fallen in love with elk hunting back in 2016. An arborist by trade and a dedicated family man, Daniel was the type of person who split his time between work, hunting, and preparing for the next big adventure. After years of hunting deer and other game, he set his sights on elk, traveling to Colorado year after year until he finally took down his first bull. That moment sealed his obsession. Elk hunting was in his blood, but hunting in Wyoming meant dealing with more than just elk. Everyone knew this was grizzly country, and Daniel was well aware of the risks. That's why he spent months preparing. When he found out he'd drawn the tag, Daniel didn't waste any time choosing the right weapon for the trip. He settled on a Remington 700, a powerful, accurate gun that packed enough punch to drop an elk, or, if necessary, defend against a grizzly. He had considered carrying a sidearm as well, but figured his rifle would be his best chance if he ever had to face off with a predator. Daniel knew that simply owning a rifle wasn't enough. If he was going to depend on it in a life or death situation, he had to train like his life depended on it. Every day he practiced drawing, aiming, and firing as quickly as possible. He drilled scenarios where he was caught off guard, simulating the sudden chaos of an ambush. By the time September arrived, he was as ready as he could be. The first day of the hunt was uneventful. Despite the stunning landscape of Wyoming's rugged wilderness, elk were proving elusive. Daniel had taken a shot at a bull, but it escaped into the thick timber. The following day, the two hunters climbed higher, hoping for better luck. They weren't alone. As they pushed through dense timber, they noticed fresh bear sign, huge claw marks on trees, turned over logs, and fresh scat. They were in grizzly territory, and that meant they had to be on high alert. Then came the noise, a violent rustling in the trees ahead, followed by a roar that shook them to their core. Daniel and Ethan instinctively shouted, "Bear!" Before Daniel could fully process what was happening, a massive grizzly exploded from the brush. He barely had time to react before the beast was nearly on top of him. With his rifle already in hand, his instincts took over. Daniel squeezed the trigger. The first shot rang out, kicking up dirt just in front of the bear. It didn't even slow down. Realizing this was no bluff charge, he fired again. The bear flinched but kept coming. By the time he fired his fifth shot, Daniel was falling backward. Ethan had been just behind Daniel when the attack began. As soon as he saw the bear charging, he pulled out his bear spray and unleashed a cloud of burning mist into the air. But the wind had different plans. The spray blew straight back into Ethan's face, blinding him instantly. He stumbled back, coughing and gagging. Still, despite the burning in his eyes, he didn't hesitate. He lifted his own rifle and fired twice into the charging bear. Daniel, now on the ground, realized that his foot was in the way of his next shot. He had seconds to adjust before the bear was on him. Twisting his body, he steadied the .365 Winchester, aimed, and fired his seventh shot. The bear, now bleeding heavily, dropped onto all fours and prepared for one last lunge. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Ethan's final shot had hit it square in the chest. The massive grizzly turned, staggered, and lumbered back toward the trees. The two men yelled at the bear, trying to scare it off. It sat back on its haunches 90 yards away, watching them. Daniel fired another shot, striking it in the hindquarters. Finally, the grizzly disappeared into the trees. Daniel and Ethan immediately radioed authorities, reporting the attack. Game wardens arrived shortly after and tracked the bear, finding its body deep in the forest. Upon investigation, they discovered something heartbreaking. The bear was a female with a cub. The cub's tracks were nearby, meaning the mother had likely been in defense mode when she attacked. Without her, the cub had little chance of survival. Daniel felt a pang of guilt, but he also knew there had been no other choice. If he hadn't reacted as quickly as he did, neither of them would have survived. The authorities ruled the shooting self-defense, acknowledging that Daniel's quick reflexes had saved his life. Sitting by the fire that night, Daniel reflected on what had just happened. He had trained for this moment, but nothing could have truly prepared him for staring death in the face. His Remington 700 had held its ground, but it had taken 7 shots to stop the bear. That was a hard lesson about the sheer toughness of these animals. Would he return to the wilderness? Absolutely. But next time, he'd be even more prepared. Because in the wild, second chances don't come easy. Surviving an attack from an enraged bear is an incredibly difficult task, even if you're properly equipped. When Lee Francis found himself facing off with a massive grizzly, he quickly pulled out his 10mm Glock pistol, thinking it would help him defend himself. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work as he had hoped. Sometimes, even with the best preparation, things don't go as planned. It was Friday, October 21st, 2022, when Lee Francis and his son set out for an elk hunt. At 65 years old, Lee, a dentist by profession, and his son Josh, also a dentist, were far from novices. In fact, they were seasoned hunters with years of experience. Armed with years of hunting experience and the excitement of the trip ahead, Lee and his son started their elk hunt with confidence. They were well prepared, knowing the risks involved. In fact, they had already faced some frightening encounters. Just a month earlier, during a bow hunting trip in September, they had a close call with not one, but 2 curious bears. The first bear had approached them, but they managed to drive it off by making noise with sticks. After the first bear retreated, they thought the danger was over. But shortly after, another bear wandered into their camp, startling their horses. The 2 bear encounters in such a short period made Lee realize the importance of taking extra precautions. Lee had always trusted his bow for hunting, but after those bear encounters, he felt the need for something more powerful for protection. So he bought a handgun to carry with him on future trips, believing it would provide an extra layer of safety if things ever took a dangerous turn. It was a decision that would seem logical to anyone venturing into the wild. On October 21st, 2022, Lee Francis and his son chose the Rock Creek region in Sublette County, Wyoming, as their hunting destination. Located south of Grand Teton National Park, this area is part of the larger Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The region is brimming with wildlife, from thousands of plant species to hundreds of bird species and numerous mammal species. It also hosts fish, reptiles, and amphibians, making it a true natural wonder. The list of animals living in Sublette County is vast, including elk, moose, mule deer, pygmy rabbits, bald eagles, wolves, grizzly bears, and many others. The land itself is ancient, with evidence suggesting that humans have been utilizing its resources for at least 11,000 years. While our methods for acquiring food, shelter, and clothing have evolved over time, hunting remains a practice for many who feel a deep connection to their ancestral roots. For these individuals, hunting is not just a pastime, but a fundamental human tradition. Lee Francis and his son were part of this group. When they set out on their hunting trip in October 2022, they had no idea that their fears of a bear encounter would soon turn into a terrifying reality, one that would nearly cost them everything. The pair, accompanied by at least one horse, were on the lookout for elk. At one point during their hunt, they decided to split up in order to cover a larger area, though they kept close enough to maintain contact. That evening, 65-year-old Lee Francis was walking through the terrain, focused on finding elk. He was so absorbed in his task that he didn't notice how close he had come to a bear's cave. It was an accidental discovery, and by the time Lee realized his mistake, the situation had already begun to spiral into a life-threatening ordeal. Lee Francis glanced around, his heart pounding as he realized just how close he was to the cave. Bears are drawn to caves for many reasons, especially as safe, secluded spots where they can hibernate or give birth to their cubs. As he surveyed his surroundings, Francis's eyes locked onto something that stopped him in his tracks: a massive grizzly bear. Time seemed to freeze for a brief moment. The creature was enormous, a true force of nature, likely weighing around 700 pounds and standing at least 8 feet tall. It was an awe-inspiring sight. In that split second, Lee knew that his window of opportunity to defend himself was rapidly closing. The animal's proximity left him with little time to think, and it felt like the bear's charge was inevitable. The moment to act was now, or never. The grizzly's eyes were full of fury, and it was coming straight at him. At 65 years old, Lee Francis had no choice but to fight back. He quickly pulled out his pistol, the one he had purchased for situations just like this. He fired, hoping to stop the bear in its tracks, but the shot had little effect. The grizzly, undeterred, kept coming at him with terrifying speed, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground beneath them. Lee had only moments before he would be overwhelmed. The bear's charging pace meant he was now the target, and his chances of survival depended on quick thinking and sheer willpower. In a moment of panic, Lee accidentally startled the bear, which only made matters worse. Bears, known for their aggression when surprised, became even more dangerous in these situations. In an instant, Francis found himself on his back, vulnerable and exposed to the grizzly's powerful jaws and razor-sharp claws. With the massive creature just inches from him, Lee fought with everything he had, kicking desperately to push the bear away. In that frantic moment, Lee's pistol finally made an impact, but not in the way he had intended. As his foot collided with the bear's skull, he fired once more. The chaos of the situation, combined with his erratic movements, caused his aim to go awry. Instead of shooting the bear, Francis accidentally shot himself in the leg. The pain was intense, but when he saw that the grizzly was retreating, he likely considered it a small price to pay. The sound of the shot, along with the pain it inflicted, scared the bear enough to make it flee. The huge grizzly ran off, leaving Francis wounded but alive. The bear's departure gave him a fleeting moment of relief, but now he needed medical help fast. His injuries, both from the bear's proximity and the self-inflicted gunshot wound, meant that time was running out. But Lee Francis, still shaken from the harrowing encounter, was thankful to have survived the deadly encounter. Josh Francis quickly rushed to his father's side, finding him injured and in shock, bleeding on the ground. Once his father was stable enough, Josh used a satellite phone to call for emergency assistance. It was just before 6 p.m. The father and son made their way towards Water Dog Lake, a nearby spot where rescue teams were prepared to meet them. They were transferred to an air ambulance waiting to fly Lee to the University of Utah Hospital in Salt Lake City. At the hospital, Lee Francis underwent 2 surgeries on his lower leg. Unfortunately, wildlife officials were unable to track down the grizzly, as snowstorms had hindered visibility. They planned to resume their search the following Monday. When reflecting on his terrifying experience with the giant bear, Lee admitted that while he had encountered large bears before, nothing could have prepared him for the sheer intensity of being charged. Although he was physically recovering from his injuries, the emotional scars remained. "I'm sure I'll have a nightmare or two the next time I'm out in the mountains," he confessed to reporters. Lee also shared some advice with others. Always carry bear protection. Bear attacks can happen in an instant. The homeowner said the bear entered through a closed door. He claimed he tried to scare it away, shouting, waving his arms, making noise. But the bear didn't run. Instead, it started moving toward his dog. Panicked, the man ran to his bedroom, grabbed a rifle, and fired. 2 shots. The bear ran, bleeding, and climbed a nearby tree, but didn't stay there long. It fell to the ground, wounded. The man walked outside and ended it with a 3rd shot. Game wardens arrived. They listened, reviewed the scene, and found the man had acted within the law. They ruled it self-defense. At first, it seemed like the end. But that same day, a neighbor made a phone call. They contacted the Bear League, a local wildlife conservation group, and told a very different story. According to the neighbor, the door wasn't shut. The bear hadn't fully entered the house, and worse, the homeowner had often spoken about hating bears and wanting to kill one. Another witness told the press they heard the first shot after the bear had already left the house. Suddenly, the narrative began to unravel. The Bear League went public. They posted photos of the bear online. One showed him alive, clinging to a tree, his face young, his frame small. People reacted fast. This wasn't self-defense. This was revenge. This was wrong. Online comments poured in. Some were heartbroken. Others were furious. Wildlife lovers said this bear didn't die because he was dangerous. He died because someone wanted him dead. But others stood by the man. They said he was in fear, that the bear had crossed a line when it entered the house and moved toward his dog. "You don't think," one supporter wrote. "You react. Anyone would have." It became more than a local story. And what happens when that line between wild and home disappears? The bear is gone now. The tree he climbed still stands. The house is still there. But South Lake Tahoe isn't the same. A young animal is dead. A man is scarred. And a community is left asking, what really happened that day? And what should happen next time? Because next time, it might not just be a bear that wanders too far. It might be us. What would you have done? Do you believe it was self-defense or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments. And if you care about stories that challenge what we think we know, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Because behind every headline, there's a truth waiting to be uncovered. On November 13, 2024, in the mountain town of Arrowbear Lake, California, a man fired 5 shots in his yard. By the time it was over, a black bear lay dead. The man said it was self-defense. Wildlife officials agreed. But the story didn't end there. Because some neighbors said the bear wasn't dangerous. Others called it murder. And once again, a small community was torn apart. Not just by what happened, but by what people believe should have happened. The bear wasn't a stranger. Locals had seen him many times, wandering the streets, sniffing around homes, slipping between pine trees. He was big, sure, but not aggressive. "If I opened the door, he'd run," one neighbor said. "Didn't stop, didn't growl, just took off." But for one homeowner, Chris, the story was different. He wasn't just watching the bear from a distance. He was living with it on his property, night after night, and the bear wasn't just passing through. Chris said he tried everything: electric fences, deterrents, bear spray. Nothing worked. The bear kept coming, breaking into his chicken coop, tearing through defenses, ignoring warnings. He even said the bear charged him once before. So when Chris saw the bear again that morning inside the coop attacking his livestock, he grabbed his rifle and fired. According to California Fish and Game Code 4181.1, if a bear is caught in the act of harming livestock, the owner is allowed to take immediate action. The Department of Fish and Wildlife ruled the shooting justified. It wasn't illegal, an officer said. He did what he had the right to do, but legal doesn't always mean accepted. Because that same day, the backlash began. Neighbors heard the shots, 3 or 4 at first, then another 2. Some were confused, others were angry. Online, the comments exploded. There had to be another way. This bear wasn't a threat. He just wanted food, not blood. Some residents stood by Chris. "I love animals too," one said, "but if Fish and Game says it's justified, then it's justified." Still, others couldn't shake the image of a bear shot dead near a coop. Not in self-defense from an attack, but while doing what wild animals do. So what really happened in Arrow Bear Lake? Was it protection, a last resort, or the result of fear pushed too far? Maybe all of it is true, maybe none of it is. But one thing is clear: the line between living with nature and fighting it is getting thinner every year. And when animals lose their fear of humans, humans tend to respond the only way they know how. What do you think? Was Chris protecting his home or crossing a line? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you care about real stories at the edge of wilderness and civilization, hit like, subscribe, and share this video. Because the wild isn't going away, and how we treat it says everything about us. When the world's largest carnivore decides you're on its menu, you have 2 choices: fight or run. Gene Moe chose to fight. Kodiak Island lies on the rugged and stunning south coast of Alaska, USA. With its sparkling rivers and frigid bays, the island is renowned for its salmon, which, during the summer months, draw fishermen from all over the globe. However, Kodiak Island is famous for another reason. The northern part of the island is covered in a dense mountainous forest, and within that forest, you'll find bears. But not just any bears. The Kodiak bear is the largest carnivore on the planet. Slightly larger than the polar bear on average, Kodiak bears are part of the brown bear species found throughout Alaska and North America. But it's their unique diet that gives them their enormous size. That diet? You guessed it, salmon. These massive creatures are fortunate enough to have a high-protein superfood right at their doorstep. This helps them grow to extraordinary sizes. Essentially, they're the bodybuilders of the animal kingdom. During peak season, adult males can weigh up to 1,400 pounds and stand as tall as 9.8 feet on their hind legs. To put that into perspective, that's roughly the weight of a grand piano and about half the height of a giraffe. Definitely not a creature you'd want to tangle with. Yet that's exactly what happened to seasoned hunter Gene Moe on November 1st, 1999. Gene had spent many years hunting in the Kodiak woods and had seen plenty of bears along the way. While he'd encountered some tense situations before, nothing had prepared him for the battle he was about to face with the largest predator on Earth. As he made his way through the forest that day, he noticed deep gouges in the bark of a tree. The markings looked almost as if they had been made by a chainsaw rather than an animal. Gene quickly recognized these as signs of a bear marking its territory and decided to move as far away as he could. But things weren't as simple as that. Gene had spent most of the day tracking a deer, and as he followed the trail, it wound in a large circle. By the time he finally caught up to the deer, he found himself right back in the bear's territory. Unfortunately, he was so focused on the hunt that he didn't realize this was his first major mistake. As the sky darkened, Gene finally took down the deer. Exhausted but satisfied, he leaned his rifle against a log and began skinning the deer beside a stream. This was where he made his second critical mistake. As Gene carefully worked to remove the hide from the deer, the scent of blood and flesh floated through the warm summer air. It didn't take long for that smell to reach the keen senses of a nearby Kodiak bear. The thing about bears is, while they're some of the top hunters in the food chain, they're just as happy to swipe someone else's meal. In an instant, Gene went from being the hunter to being the hunted. One moment, he was bent over the deer, focused on his task. The next, an earth-shaking roar echoed through the woods. The bear's roar was so deafening that it seemed to rattle the very trees around him. Without warning, the bear charged out of the forest, barreling into Gene with the force of a runaway train. He was thrown to the ground, and the bear's claws raked at his throat with terrifying precision. Gene found himself trapped beneath the bear's immense bulk, its fur filling his mouth and eyes, disorienting him completely. He couldn't see, he couldn't breathe, and he couldn't scream. It was like being caught in the worst bear hug imaginable. In a stroke of luck, Gene still had his knife in hand. Desperately, he drove it into the thick fur and hide of the bear, but his efforts were in vain. The animal's jaws clamped down on his arm, crushing it with unimaginable pain. Despite the agony, Gene somehow kept his wits about him, continuing to stab and kick at the beast. His heavy mountain boots, likely a lifesaver, allowed him to muster just enough strength to kick the bear off him. As soon as he was free, Gene scrambled to his feet, taking in a deep breath of air. The ability to see and breathe again overwhelmed him, and for a moment, he thought he might not make it out of the bear's deadly grasp. The relief Gene felt didn't last long. His heart sank when he saw his gun still leaning against the log, out of reach. It was too far to grab before the bear would be on him again. If it got him down once more, he wouldn't have the strength to get up. With no time to waste, he abandoned the gun and instead thrust his knife into the bear's neck, aiming for its throat. His body was flooded with adrenaline, every nerve urging him to survive. But the bear's neck muscles were like thick, tangled roots, and the blade only managed to leave a deep gash. Once again, luck was on his side. With the quick reflexes of a prize bullfighter, Gene dodged at the last second, narrowly avoiding the bear's massive body. He saw his opening and drove the knife down as hard as he could, aiming for the vertebrae in its back. The blade sank in. For a brief moment, Gene's heart seemed to stop as the bear roared again. The bear, clearly wounded, backed off and began circling. Gene stood frozen, not daring to move. He knew if the bear charged again, it would likely be the end. Staring into the bear's eyes, Gene knew only one thing could save him now: God. "Lord," he whispered aloud, "please help me, Lord. I need help." Just as he spoke, the bear lunged again. This time, it seemed slower, blood staining its fur as it charged forward. Gene reacted without thinking. He dropped his knife and swung his good arm in a wide arc, landing a powerful punch directly on the bear's nose. His fist collided with such force that he heard a cracking sound and felt his hand break in several places. But the bear staggered back, then collapsed to the ground. Its enormous head came to rest on the moss with a final thud. Gene stood breathless, wondering if the beast was truly dead. Wincing in pain, he limped over to his gun, but his hands were covered in blood and numb from the injury. He couldn't pull the trigger. Fortunately, the bear was already motionless. But Gene's incredible story didn't end there. Gene knew he was losing a lot of blood and urgently needed to get off the island and to a hospital. Once again, he prayed, asking for the strength to make it to the beach where his friend's boat was waiting. And once again, his prayers were answered. The journey was far from easy. Climbing down the mountain was the hardest thing Gene had ever done. 3 times he collapsed into the moss, ready to give up, but each time he prayed for strength and managed to push himself back to his feet. Finally, he reached the shore, where his friend helped him to a nearby cabin. From there, they managed to call for a helicopter. It took Gene a month of rehabilitation, 2 skin grafts, and 500 stitches, but eventually he made a full recovery. In the end, he came out victorious, with the bear's skin later recovered and preserved. To this day, Gene Moe proudly displays the bear's skin on his wall as a reminder of his remarkable survival. As incredible as Gene's story is, there are still many who question whether it really happened the way he tells it. Some dismiss it as a wild tale, one that could only exist in the realm of legends. After all, who could survive such a brutal attack from one of the largest predators on Earth? How could a man, alone in the wilderness, fend off a Kodiak bear with nothing but sheer will and a knife? But Gene's story has been told time and time again, and there are those who stand by it, who believe in the strength of the human spirit and the divine intervention that seemed to guide him through his ordeal. They argue that the evidence, Gene's recovery, the bear's skin still hanging on his wall, speaks for itself. His friends and family swear by the truth of his words, recounting his experience with awe and respect. And yet, there are still skeptics who refuse to accept that a man could survive such a horrific attack without the aid of modern tools or the help of others. They ask questions, pointing out the inconsistencies and small details that seem too extraordinary to be believed. Could a single shot really bring down such a mighty beast? Could a knife truly make the difference between life and death in a struggle with a grizzly? Now, as you hear this story, you too might be questioning what you've just heard. Is it possible that one man could survive such an encounter? Would you believe the story if you were hearing it from someone else? Or would you be skeptical, unsure of whether it's all just a tall tale? You are left to decide. Did Gene truly face down a Kodiak bear and live to tell the tale? Or is this just a story spun out of myth and exaggeration? What do you believe? The answer, as always, is up to you.